William Little is a professor in Victoria in Canada and a sociologist, theorist, Aikidoka, and I'm talking to him today. Hello, Bill, how are you doing?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so it's early in the morning there and it's almost evening here, and we're just marveling at the wonders of modern technology, aren't we? So with Zoom and everything. But you are, I mean, we've met once or twice before, I think. You've been to the conferences and you've published in the journal. And I mean, to me, from what I've read of your work, you're a sociologist by training, you read cultural theory and cultural philosophy, and you do Aikido, and you kind of you approach Aikido through these different philosophical lenses of philosophers like Giorgio Agamben, Michel Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari. And I mean, the first question that I have for you is, do you think that your choice of this kind of nexus of theorists, this post-structuralist field, is kind of necessary, or is it just like it just so happens to be helpful, or might there be other philosophical traditions that would be equally as fruitful for you, or is it something about Agamben or about Foucault that kind of made you draw the two together? What do you think happened there?
Well, yeah, I guess the simple answer would be those were the thinkers that I was involved with, or that I've been interested in from my master's, well, undergraduate on. I mean, one thing that's been quite interesting about martial arts studies and my introduction to it through your journal and work and so on is that when I was stumbling over some of the concepts, because I'm not actually a trained philosopher. I wish I had more of that background. As a sociologist, we come into it somewhat more superficial approach to it. So I get stuck on something like in Agamben, in particular, for example. I was quite fascinated by his analysis and critique of power, his use of Foucault to discuss biopolitics, but then his sort of supplementing of Foucault to discuss the power that operates through sovereignty, in particular the sovereign exception, what happens when states suspend the laws during times of crisis. But his kind of antidote to that, or the focus of his research, came down to this concept, this strange concept that he called form of life, form hyphen of hyphen life hyphen. And when he tries to define it, it's kind of like, yeah, this sounds good, but where's a concrete, tangible example? Where's, for the sociologist, where's the evidence? Where's the social form in everyday social life that I can examine? And weirdly, also I've been practicing Aikido and pretty steadily for the last. I started as a young guy, but moved around quite a bit, and didn't get a regular practice going till 15, 16 years ago, and then was quite dedicated. But the two sides of my life didn't actually meet until it's like, okay, well, form of life, this I think that I can actually begin to unravel what Agamben means by beginning to think about a little bit more theoretically, or about what we do in the martial arts. So that's kind of why Agamben was so central to my has been so central to my attempt to write about the martial arts. It's because the martial arts themselves offered a kind of a way into a concept which I otherwise, it's like a fuzzy concept that that sounds really good. It sounds like it solves all the problems that Agamben points out. It is a kind of antidote to all the forms of power that are operating on us. And yet, what does it actually mean? And then when I go back and I start reading, Mori Ueshiba's essays, the way in which he begins to pose the nature of Aikido, really, in a sense, I get as a response to the crisis of the Japanese Pacific War. trying to think of a martial art that would, in a sense, still be a martial art, but would free one from the militarism, free one from the basically the state of exception of that long period of Japanese invasion of Asia and the war with Europe and the States and so on. And his reflections on what a martial art would be in a time of peace or a peaceful art all revolve around some kind of integration, or Aikido, essentially harmonization, a reintegration of the body, a reintegration of the individual with the forces of the universe, with universal ki, and so on and so forth. And so, if the underlying concept of Agamben seemed to be a kind of his form of life concept was a kind of a non-alienated existence, somewhat akin to Karl Marx's notion, but different kind of a register. Morihei Ueshiba is also talking about an integrated, a non-alienated existence. And moreover, because Agamben and Foucault, Deleuze, and so on are often speaking about things which have to do with the body, with, in a sense, truths that are accessed through the body, truths which can only sort of inadequately be expressed in language. The concept in Morihei Ueshiba's work is also that it's only through continuous training that one can actually go through the transformation required in order to attain this knowledge, this knowledge of integration, this Aiki. Otherwise, it's just a kind of a word. It's just maybe it's an aspirational word, but it's just an abstract concept. It's only through the body that one can understand what it actually means to harmonize your energy. So it's a beautiful kind of opportunity to connect these two worlds, which I had, for whatever reason, Aikido did in the evening, school, university work I did in the day, and between them there wasn't very much interaction. So yeah, I mean, I could go on at length about like what I love about Foucault, Deleuze, and Agamben, but
well, maybe we can. But because I mean, I was thinking, is it something that is the Aikido practice, is the regular disciplined practice of an embodied physical practice like Aikido, is that something that you think might give you an extra perspective on these philosophers and on the things that they talk about, that maybe someone who doesn't do martial arts or equivalent, maybe they couldn't get it? Because my question is loaded because I was once talking to a very eminent professor of Chinese literature and culture, and I kind of said, well, I don't really know much about China or Chinese culture, but what I do know, I accessed all through martial arts. It all came through everything around martial arts. And she said that she thought I had quite a sort of unique and strong grasp of things that people wouldn't otherwise get. And then similar, but from the other way around, recently I was starting to read the work of Peter Sloterdijk, the German philosopher, who is equally inspired by Foucault and Nietzsche and the same kind of body of thinkers as a lot of other post-structuralists. And I talked to other academics and they said, oh yeah, I remember Sloterdijk, really difficult. But for me, he was just talking about the stuff that we do every day, the kind of meditative, ascetic approach that we have. And when I've read lots of reviews about Sloterdijk, people don't seem to get it. It's like, I think you don't get it. You're not getting it because like you're either preoccupied with his reading of Nietzsche, or you're preoccupied with his what he says about Christianity or Hinduism or something. But he's not talking about that. He's talking about the insights that you can just access by regularly being involved in something that could be regarded as ascetic, such as daily kata, daily forms, daily meditation, daily qigong, something like that. So I mean, that's why I asked, do you think that it's something about your physicality that enabled you to go Agamben, or Foucault, I get it. It's simple. It makes perfect sense. It unlocks all of this. Or is that the kind of process? One of those variants or something different?
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I think you've kind of put your finger on it. It's as I was saying, like particularly with Agamba, when it came to him talking about this concept of form of life, I just found it somewhat mystifying. You know, I mean, I liked it, right? It's like, oh, this must be right. This must be true. But it's kind of like I had actually no way of accessing what that meant. And then Sloterdijk is an interesting character too, because I mean, I think he wants to redefine religion as simply all the sets of ascetic practices by which one transforms oneself through multiple different cultures and so on. And I think that there's a piece in Michel Foucault's later lectures where he seems to be exclusively interested in these practices of the self, which we see all around us in Western life. You know, everything from yoga to nutritional regimes to if you're just doing a hobby these days, you've got to somehow like get into it so deeply that you make your life revolve around it. But one thing about the so-called spiritual practices, which Foucault begins to talk about, is that he says, again, it's a mysterious thing. He says something to the effect that spiritual practice is different from an ordinary practice of the self. A spiritual practice of the self is different in the sense that one has to, one is ascetic, one submits to a kind of a regular regime of disciplinary practices that one voluntarily poses on oneself. But it differs from other types of practices that we're more familiar with, in that you have to actually, in order to attain the knowledge that is offered by, say, Aikido, you actually have to go through some sort of fundamental transformation in yourself. And I think this is also Sloterdijk's point about like what characterizes a religion. And so what does that actually mean though? You have to change yourself. And it's, I think that, again, I probably could have practiced Aikido on simply, despite all the talk about harmony and mind, body, and spirit, and so on, I probably could have practiced Aikido on the purely physical plane for my entire life. Learning techniques, learning how to do them better. That's an embodied knowledge. There's kind of like where the person's balance is, where the weight is, how you respond to that. That's again something, if I wanted to describe it in language, I could talk for pages about something which takes only an instant to know in your body. And so there's something about the true bodily knowledge there. But in order to like take the next step or whatever, as Mordechai Shiva describes it, to transform yourself to a higher knowledge, you have to somehow go through a process by which you are fundamentally changed. And it's very difficult, I think, for us, coming from the typical kind of materialist Western backgrounds. Kind of like the body is just the thing carrying me around. Sometimes it gets injured, sometimes I can train it gets faster, so on and so forth. I can recognize that there's something going on there, but it's sort of like the vehicle that carries me around. But it wasn't until I practiced Qigong, for example, and they said, okay, stand in the horse stance here and do that for half an hour a day. And eventually you'll feel your Qi energy, and you will be able to, create a circuit. You have your hands out, you get a circuit between your Aigu points here, and you'll no longer be having to like use your muscles to hold your arms up. Your arms will hold themselves up by themselves because you will be in a circuit of Qi energy. And I was thinking, to myself, like, oh yeah, well, that sounds great. That'll be amazing. I'm never going to learn that. But then actually you learn it. It's like, oh, there's another type of energy here in my body, which has these properties. It seems to be moving in a circular, and so it's like kind of a trend. Like, I'm not exactly sure how that happened, right? Like, how do you does it just happen, or do you have to somehow change a little thing in yourself in order to be able to experience that? So yeah, so these concepts of like a spiritual practice in Foucault, or in Sloterdijk, or the form of life in Agamben, are in a certain way, I think, would have been inaccessible to me if I hadn't had this body practice, Aikido or Qigong or various other. At the same time, what's been interesting to me is the way in which, by becoming aware of this other element, this, say, spiritual dimension, and again, using spirit in the way Foucault talks about it, it's not kind of not Jesus or anything, or God or so on, but it's more like what an access to a truth that you can't access unless you change something in yourself. By becoming aware of this aspect, it began to actually improve my Aikido. Right? It began to like take seriously this notion that, okay, you're not fighting with somebody, you're not pushing people, you're not using your muscles, you've got to be aware of the entire space of the interaction. You've got to be aware of like weirdly the tensions in a space, like an ordinary kind of point of view is it's just air between you and your point. But of course, when your one side of you is exposed, the other side of you is actually open to an attack, there's a kind of like a pressure in that space. And there is also vacuums in that space. There's also vortices in that space. There's also all these other kind of dimensions of the situation, which you're otherwise unaware of, become visible, and you begin to move in that space. And I think if you look at even the old Morihei Ueshiba that one sees on videos, you see him as a 80-year-old man, 70-year-old man, throwing these young guys around. And obviously he wasn't as strong as he was when he was in his 50s and so on, like physically strong, but it's actually the manipulation of the space, the anticipation of the other person's movement, which takes you to this next level. So there's been a kind of, anyways, I guess was the point, is there's been a kind of lovely reciprocity between the academic work, which opens me up to the kind of wider implications, political and otherwise, of the study, and the martial art itself, which allows me to actually parse some of these otherwise obscure, talk about obscure, like Gilles Deleuze's concepts of affect and war machine, and a different sort of a plane of immanence. These concepts, which are like, love them, but what do they mean? Become actually tangible through practice, and open up your practice along a different line.
So is thinking about the notion of change that you're talking about. So I understand what you're saying when you, especially with something like Tai Chi or Qigong, where you practice something and you can't do it, and you just can't do it, and then you just can. Well, one day you just can. I remember learning, practicing the applications of diagonal flying, which you get in judo, you presumably get in Aikido as well, where you just basically turn and drop someone. You get your arm under their shoulder and you just turn and you just drop them. And I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And then then you can, and you can no longer remember not being able to do it. And also the way that you move, or the way that you move people, or the way that you can thud them out of the way with, like, with press or something like this. And you can't remember not being able to do that. And it reminds me of something that my mother once said to me when I was trying to teach my children, my young toddler in nappies, and like, or whatever it was, just like, and my mother just said, look, just chill out, because they can't do it now, but one day they'll just be able to do it. They'll just do it one day. So just do it for them now. And I'm wondering if you're saying that the change is the change in the self, when you're talking about spirituality, which is a term that I worry about and hesitate before using because I don't know what it means. Um, are you just talking about that kind of change from one day you can't do something, next day you just can, that change? And you can't really communicate that to someone. You just have to practice, you just have to try. Or is it something that practical change enables? Are you talking about a new perspective that is inexpressible in some way, or is it just the fact that it's inexpressible for me to say, well, one day I couldn't do this, next day I can, and all I can do is show you the way, so to speak, but you just have to practice. I mean, what does that change consist of or consist in, do you think?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind because yeah, definitely. I think that the ability to like do the technique, which again you can watch it. It's like this is how you do it, and you go up and do it. It's like this doesn't work. This doesn't work, and then one day it works. I think that is um, an embodied knowledge. That is a knowledge that you learn through the body, which you would have difficulty expressing that in language, and it points to a kind of a dimension of this is kind of odd, given the background that we both share in structuralism, post-structuralism, but it points to an aspect, an experience, a dimension of experience, which is in a sense outside of language, which is obviously accessible by language. We're talking about it right now, but somehow that truth itself is not, it has another dimension. It has another, dimension of weight, dimension of proximity to the other person and so on, which you feel, and that's the way, that's how you learn it. I think that the spiritual practice that Foucault indicates is something more than that, because I think any athlete goes through these bodily knowledges. You talk about a child goes through these bodily knowledges and so on, ability to do things, and then the next day they can't. There's something, just the way in which Sensei or Moriya Shiba talks about, truly spiritual dimension, which is, how do you walk amongst the kami, or how do you, and how do you elevate yourself to a kind of an experience in which you are fully aware of flows of ki in the universe and aligning yourself with those. I think that that's another, it is something that one accesses through the body that I don't think that we can really, using our kind of Western sociology or philosophies, can't really talk about, but we can experience, or we can begin to experience, we can begin to open up that dimension. Like, for example, I think it's the difference between you being able to do your technique and you being able to do your qigong, and recognizing that, oh, there is ki, there is an energy flow here that I wasn't aware of my entire life. It's obviously been there the whole time, but my face is getting all mottled, my hand, I'm getting et cetera, you can feel the energy moving, and then you begin to like, okay, what do I need to do to change myself in order to access that more? That is kind of like a step into this.
Yeah. I mean,
it's spiritual, but it's it's obviously, as you're saying,
it's interesting that you mention the kind of problems that people who are supposedly steeped and well versed and kind of faithful to post-structuralist theory would the problems they would have when you talk about something that evades language. It got me thinking about something that might segue into another one of your interests, which is the theme of deep ecology that we can talk about in a minute. It's where it reminded me of the book by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. So Eve Sedgwick, as you know, was an arch kind of queer theorist. She was one of the big people who used post-structuralism and deconstruction and Foucault and so on to really write about queer theory. And then it was kind of towards the end of her life, when she just came out of the closet in terms of being really into Buddhism really into Taoism. And in that book, it's called Touching Feeling, it's about affect and pedagogy and so on. She talks about, she wonders out loud whether she was drawn to deconstruction and post-structuralism because it seemed so Buddhist, or whether she was drawn to Buddhism because it seemed so post-structuralist, because it's kind of, it's anti-essentialist, it's processual, it's not like our being isn't a fixed Aristotelian or Platonic entity or substance. We're always just in process, it's always just becoming. And so despite the fact that we may hesitate as academics, as professional academics, before we talk about things that escape language, we don't have to do that really to kind of draw deconstruction, post-structuralism, Deleuze and Foucault into a relationship and into dialogue with, or into even intimate contact with Buddhism and Taoism and these kind of anti-essentialist ontologies. I mean, does that and then we're close to also to, we're in the orbit almost of questions of Taoism and therefore ecological concerns. Is this where your interest lies now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. I you know, because of the martial arts studies, because of the conference a couple of years ago in Orange County, where we're talking about politics of martial arts, nationalism on all these issues, I began to think about my own introduction to martial arts. And I came across it in a philosophy class. Like I had been interested in martial arts. In fact, I think I had done some karate. I think I had shared a fascination with Bruce Lee whenever I could see a Bruce Lee movie on, Canadian CBC television, which was rare. I was glued to the set, but that was about it. And then a philosophy class on philosophy of the environment and deep ecology, my professor Alan Jensen, he was a wonderful lecturer in that he would just spill stories, tell these yarns. And it would often walk, this morning I was walking my dog, and what an activity walking your dog is, like where the dog takes you into the world where you wouldn't go into the world yourself, type of thing. And so anyways, I just sort of reflecting on my introduction to, it was in this context, in the context of, he also taught a course on Eastern religion or Eastern philosophies. He taught a course on environmental philosophy, which morphed into his interest in what he called deep ecology. It was in that context that he also talked about Aikido, and he actually had a course credit course at UVic in which you could take Aikido and get a university credit. In any case, he invited us, the philosophy class, to come, and we went. And unfortunately, he was a lovely speaker, but he was kind of like sometimes oblivious to his audience. And so we would be sitting there in Seiza. I was waiting for the opportunity to get up off of our knees finally, because they're just like burning or in pain, and he would be going on about the fine details. Anyways, to get to your question there, I began to realize that my introduction to Aikido, which associated it all the time with deep ecology, as Alan Jensen described it, Aikido was a whole art that involved a kind of entire reorientation of one's life to a kind of condition of nonviolence, but also respect for nature, of being immersing oneself in nature. And I think this, for my 20-year-old mind was like, oh, this is heaven. This is like, a Laban's philosophy, right? A meaningful philosophy of tying these ideas about the nature of the world to an actual practice, and of finding a reason, like why are we living, how do we live, and so on. And I guess later on, preparing for that conference in Orange County, I began to think, well, actually, most of the people I practice Aikido with and come across in our big seminars and so on, don't have this background. I just sort of, these are my assumptions, that Aikido was deep ecology. Aikido was a way of getting deeper into the natural world. The Aikido forms were based on natural principles, spirals, and flow of energy, and mutual respect, and in a sense, love. Aiki as love for others and for the nature. And through Aikido practice, one could deepen one's relationship to nature and to the various forms of nature. I began to realize that this was maybe a very rare little kind of segment of the Aikido world, which I had always assumed was the entire thing, right? That everybody shared these same principles. So I began to reflect on, okay, well, what, as we were asked in that conference to reflect on the politics of martial arts, I began to think about, well, what is the politics of Aikido? What is the politics of deep ecology itself? Because both of them are, in a certain way, apolitical. They don't have any obvious politics. And I mean, deep ecology obviously lends itself to the environmental movement. Aikido obviously lends itself to kind of modes of reconciliation, nonviolent interactions with others. But beyond that, it's not like it's not left or right. It's not, communist, fascist, democratic, so on and so forth. It's kind of cutting a different line through the whole kind of scene of politics. So it does strike me that the meeting point, sort of getting back to your point about Buddhism and post-structuralism, so the kind of the meeting point, the place where Aikido and deep ecology met was through the concept of harmony. And that's obviously also a politically dangerous concept and has pretty, potentially dangerous political usages, and has had, the harmonized society, well, is generally these feudal societies were harmonious, from the point of view of the historians or something, because they're written from the point of view of the people on top, and they involved hierarchies and the body and, an organic unity when everybody knew their place and stayed in their place type of thing. But I think the way in which harmony works, again, as a practice of the self, as an embodied thing that one only learns through some kind of deep embodied daily practice, goes the other way. It basically unwinds or deconstructs all these hierarchies on a continual basis. And so harmony with nature in the deep ecology, for maybe people who, again, like my assumptions are that everybody knows what deep ecology is as well. And deep ecology was the principle that all life, all living things have intrinsic value, that the world is not a resource that we can manage, in a good point of view, like carbon management or sustainable development, all these sort of common environmental themes. Deep ecology said, no, that's still a use of the environment as a resource that we can serve. What would it be like to orient our life and our civilization to coexistence with nature, recognizing that each creature's life and trajectory is intrinsically valuable as a human life is, for example? How would we reorient ourselves to that? How will we develop a kind of a harmony with nature? How would we have to change society, practices, and so on? And anyway, so this concept of harmony is the one that I think in Alan Drinkson's mind, my professor's mind, and in my own understanding, which, again, having to go back into time to actually, okay, what is it that I actually think about this? Like, where did these ideas come from? Harmony as a kind of a continual unraveling of relations of power, unraveling of our own self, in a sense, again, on this kind of path to self-transformation, to be able to access truths of living in a deeper way in the world, and so on and so forth. Harmony, and again, tying into you know, Alan Watts's ways of liberation, you know, this kind of Taoist principle that is in us all, which is somehow buried for Alan Watts. And you just have to like somehow take a little step to the left and see it. Otherwise you miss it. Otherwise you pave it over with your projects and so on. And so how can one get to a position in which, you know, one can act without acting all these kind of Taoist principles? And it seemed anyways that there is a politics in that, and it's one which I've been trying to think through by going back to my own history and to my teacher, Alan Johnston's kind of way of framing the issue of the sort of accidental coincidence of a Japanese martial art, which has a Japanese lineage, and a kind of ecological movement, which developed all of a sudden, I think on the west coast of North America, principally as a set of ecological, working out a kind of way of life based on ecological understanding. These two things meet, and in that conjunction, in that combination, something new emerges, which is again, a form of life, I think, taking it back to again.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, there's an awful lot in there. It's interesting. What one thing, when you told me you were interested in exploring the idea of the relations between, say, Aikido and deep ecology, is I was wondering precisely the kind of thing that you mentioned, which is, are you assuming, and you just said that you did assume, that other Aikido practitioners would be like-minded when it came to an ethos or an ideology, or possibly even something that we might call a politics? But as you suggested, you know, people kind of aren't. And I wonder, and I try to think back to every different martial arts discipline that I've been to classes, and you think, there's some of them you just think, no, everyone's different here. Everyone, they could be left wing, right wing, they could be green, they could be anything in this particular club here. But then you go to some clubs, like you go to a Tai Chi class, and my operating assumption is, you know, these people are hippies, right? And 9 times out of 10 they are. And you think, well, I am a bit part of the Venn diagram of me maps onto this ethos. But I wonder about, to say that Aikido or deep ecology is neither left wing nor right wing. And I wonder about these. I mean, I wonder if it's a plane of immanence. I wonder if it's a trajectory. There's 2 thoughts fighting to get out here. One is, do you think that a practice like Aikido or maybe Tai Chi or Qigong has something that is imminent to it, like, or was really likely to try and get out, which might be something that we might want to call ecological, and like a Taoist sort of Buddhist and therefore potentially ecological outlook? And another one is a question that I don't really expect you to be able to answer, but it's something that I've noticed about ideologies of martial artists, and it's the way in which, say, in this COVID-19 pandemic, it's astonishing the strange line that the strange cuts through people's belief systems that the anti-vax movement has. And you'll get people who, like, my instant assumption is, well, these are stupid people, but they're not stupid people. They might be like people in the BJJ community who are like, yeah, I'm just fit and I'm strong, and all you need to be is fit and healthy. And I guess you're going to get Taoists and hippies who say all you need to do is meditate a bit more and do some qigong, and I'll be strong because of my chi. And so there's a line being cut here that doesn't fall into left or right. It doesn't fall into intellectual or non-intellectual, high culture, low culture. It's got a different plane that I wonder, you know, it's so many. So yeah, my question is, I've scuppered myself in the asking of the question, but you know, these things all seem to relate in a way that you might want to kind of broach at some point in your thinking about politics of Aikido and deep ecology and so on. I mean, pick up any of that, because there's too much there. Go with whatever you like.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have been definitely trying to grapple with. I mean, there's a kind of what I see in the politics of this is a kind of art of disengagement from the frameworks of just the sort of mindless way in which, like, looking at American politics from up here in Canada, it's just like it's like liberals and conservatives, right? And the conservatives are all sort of Donald Trumpets, and the liberals are, Clinton. And there's, in Canada, at least we have three options, but it just seems like, the way political systems get structured around these ideas, which then become looser and like ever more simulacral in relationship to anything sort of tangible on the ground. And so there's something about, I think it was what I've been trying to explore with this deep ecology Aikido thing, which brings it back to the tangible way in which powers are exercised over our bodies in biopolitics and in sovereign power, according to Gem's analysis, and what happens when we begin to unwind those powers or reverse those powers or create a space in which those powers can be resisted. And I think that there is a way in which focusing on the bodily truths of this do not lend themselves to any kind of like, okay, the Aikidoists and the deep ecologists are going to walk forth in the streets and we're going to take down the government sort of thing. But there is a way in which for the deep ecologist, and here I think of, the beat poet Gary Snyder, and his trajectory through all of the things that we've been taught, from kind of early appreciation of Zen Buddhism to ecology to translating Chinese poems to going to study in Zen monastery. At the end of the 1950s, and his kind of ethic of deep ecology, which would be, you find yourself in a place, you sort of dig in there, and you start to build connections, and you start to work on, like, how can we improve our relationship to nature here? And it means dealing with people from all different ways of thinking and trying to find some sort of common. Everybody's living in a place. We all want to protect this place. We all like this place. How do we manage, and, I don't get, obviously he's associated with hippies and Beat Generation and so on and so forth, but, I don't read his politics as being, he's like a Democrat or he's a Republican or something like that, right? There's a kind of a different mode. And there's something about the way in which, I think, that what I've been particularly interested in is a kind of the space that opens up through the counterculture, through people like Alan Watts, who kind of open up this space in which we begin to think about things like martial arts and ecology in a different way. And so, for example, you read about Aikido in Japan. It doesn't have a countercultural reference point. It's not, or maybe it does now, right? In some of the ways that you've been talking about, that look at how the West has received Aikido, and then they take this back and they rethink what Aikido means there. But originally, certainly Moriai Ueshiba is not a figure who one would consider as a countercultural figure. In fact, he would be much more the other way. His associations with the rise of militarism in Japan are, take that as kind of like a pretty unsavory connection, some of them. But he was himself influenced through Geshi and the Amoto-kyo kind of Shinto revival movement, and in a certain way, his kind of way of thinking takes a step in a weird way, apolitical, outside of politics, disengaged from politics, but and also from religion, that opens up this whole world of, okay, so if I devote myself to trying to attain this unity with the universal key, what does my life become, and what issues from that? And in terms of politics, it strikes me that the more you try to focus on this deepening one's relationship through bodily practice to this dimension, which isn't readily accessible from strictly empirical materialist means, that one is constantly obliged to modify or unwind or jettison the ordinary kind of political left-right concepts, and become more fully focused on a kind of a tangible, lived, bodily interaction with people, centered and grounded, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't mean that you obviously can't participate in politics, but politics seems to have this sort of arbitrary quality to it. Again, for that conference, when I was thinking about in Orange County, and I was thinking about the politics of Aikido, in the back of my mind, there's all the reports from the Guardian and so on about mixed martial arts and fascism and so on and so forth. And you begin to think, well, is there some intrinsic politics to martial arts, or are they just freely available for any politic to come along and sort of label them and pick them up in their own name? And obviously the relationship between martial arts and right-wing movements, fascist-like movements, is evident throughout history, and there's a lot of good work on the relationship between nationalism and martial arts that's being done there. But I was thinking, well, I mean, that was so different or so contrary to my experience of the martial arts, which had, again, immediately this association with deep ecology and the deep ecology movement. But I began to think, okay, so what exactly is it in this practice of the self that would resist the fascist tendencies? And that's where I again turn to Deleuze and Guattari, in particular Michel Foucault's preface to their Anti-Oedipus, in which he just in a few short pages sort of outlines his take on what they're up to. And he describes it, interestingly enough, as a kind of a practice of the self and ethics, in which one tries to free oneself of fascism, not just simply the political movement fascism, not the state structure of fascism, but the fascism within us. And so what type of ongoing practice do we have to engage in to resist our own fascist tendencies, our own, I'm just the boss here, I'm going to tell you what to do, and if you don't obey me, I'm just going to smash you, and I'm going to build up a whole kind of world view based on power and my ability, and my race and so on and so forth. How do we continually, I mean, these are traps that we easily slip into in our own thinking in whatever realm of life. At this direct individual practice of the self level, Foucault suggests that Deleuze and Guattari are describing a set of procedures, a set of ascetic practices that allow us to continually sort of resist those fascist tendencies. So again, I was thinking, well, the relationship between Aikido and deep ecology, in this blending, in this sort of it's a meeting in the middle quality of these two kind of separate things, is this sort of process of continually resisting a kind of a micro-fascism, and a constant sort of this word unraveling or disengagement from the ego, constantly modifying the ego in order to attain some sort of again, unity, some sort of harmony with nature. And again, the harmony with nature thing is something which comes and goes. right? Just like in practice, I don't know what your practice is like, but in Aikido is like, wow, that was a really good throw. That just worked out amazingly. And then there's another one in which, I really had to fight with, there was no flow. I had to actually use my strength, and I can hear sensei shouting at me, stop using your arms there, or whatever. So this harmony is a constant kind of self-reflection on how one can continually attune oneself. And I think the same is with deep ecology, right? Deep ecology, and both the Aikido and deep ecology, or martial arts, and have this sort of, I think there is always a tendency for things to become fascistic, in the sense that in deep ecology, there was, for example, this sort of sense that, the Earth First movement here on the West Coast, which was, we are going to be eco-warriors out there protecting the Earth at whatever cost, no matter what the consequences are. We're going to spike trees, we're going to disable forestry equipment, and so on and so forth. And we don't care about the best world was a world in which there were no humans. Humans have got to stop overpopulating the world, et cetera, et cetera. There's a kind of like, as it built into a movement, all of these kind of principles are maybe good, but at the same time, the way they were exercised, got the label. So deep ecology became labeled as kind of eco-fascistic in some ways, because people sort of take these principles to club each other over the head with them, and so on and so forth. It seemed like, and with Aikido, it's obviously, just Moriya Ueshiba's history. Like, he was there training military officers and Japanese spies. He was talking about, in the 1930s, he went through the stage of his own, he separated from the Daitoryo style and made his own Aikibudo, again on the principles of Aiki, but he was using it. He had no qualms about showing the Japanese spies how to break somebody's neck. There's no kind of like, let's find a place where both people walk away alive and better, as in Aikido. But let's use these as martial principles. And so separately, I think Aikido and deep ecology have these potentials to build themselves into things, and then all of a sudden, my thing is better than yours, and you get into conflict. But in between the two, there's an interesting space in which there's a sort of continual unwinding of identities in this sort of constant training in order to attain Aiki or harmonization. And there's an interesting politics in that. Like, again, I have, what are the politics in that? I'm trying to think through it, but we have lessons from Gary Snyder and so on, my teacher Alan Jensen, and so on, as ways of living which are constantly seeking greater harmony, greater in-depth relationship with nature, conscious awareness of nature, sinking into nature. And from that position, I think, ways of life, which, form of life, political community, all emerge in a kind of a different way from a centered and grounded place. Anyways, that's
okay. So I try to keep these podcasts less than 1 hour.
Sure.
But that, so I think we might have 5 minutes left or so before I break my own rule. But so what? Just, I guess, to wrap up, I mean, how far along are you with the project? Is it going to be a book? Are you going to do journal articles? Is this going to come out a piece at a time, or are you planning a kind of magnum opus, or what? What are we looking at here in terms of when we're going to see a written word or a lecture series or something? I mean,
yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the sad thing about it was that I think that this was originally just going to be a chapter in the book that Andreas and Ben were putting together, and COVID happened. I got diverted into building a house on my island where I'm going to hopefully live a kind of deep ecological life at some point. So maybe the outcome of this will actually be in life. But it's at the moment is a kind of a lengthy, overly long essay, which I am sort of picking away at it. Just it's interesting the work process. I haven't, again, I was away from it for several months, so coming back to it later with kind of refreshed ideas, it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of interesting. I'd like to actually focus on that more. So at the moment, yeah, maybe it will appear as an article.
Okay.
And I don't have book ambitions. I mean, I would, if I could read Japanese, I think there's so much, that I would love to know about Morihei Ueshiba's politics and go back through that whole period and his relationship to the Yamato people and where all these ideas came from. It just seems so fascinating, and the literature on unfortunately kind of the literature on Morihei Ueshiba is so respectful, let's say, that it's either respectful or disrespectful, and between those two, one has a hard time getting at the truth. But yeah, so
Well,
I'm just working on a essay.
that sounds like you need that's a collaborative research project there. You need to organize something with a Japanese university with like-minded, equivalent researchers who can answer some of the questions that you can pose to them, and then that sounds like a conference. That sounds like a fab conference, like somewhere like Waseda or somewhere.
Wow,
that would be excellent. Let's sort that out. Let's have a.
Let's do it. Sure.
translating Aikido or something conference. That would be great. But I'm gonna try and stick within my 1 hour rule, and I'm gonna thank you very much for taking the time out of your house building and your essay writing and your research to talk to me. So thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thanks for the questions. They're great.